Neon Green Network begrüßt die Unternehmerin, Autorin und Fernsehköchin Sarah Wiener.
Good evening. Well, how brave you are that you've stayed until the end. Thank you very much, Robert, for your very inspiring and great presentation with so much input. I'm still digesting what you said. Well, let's change the topic, even though the climate change also has lots to do with the soil. The soil stores more gases harmful to the climate than all plants and the atmosphere together. Hardly anyone would know that fact. Well, as every person, I have some words I particularly like passion or special dumplings made of curd cheese and apricots, or erdreich, a German word that has just turned into one of my favorite words. Erdreich means the area of our earth and the richness. But what do we know about that land of our earth, the soil, which mostly is dirt for us? Let me just tell you a few things I've been fascinated by. With some soil scientists, we've been pondering the special cosmos being created below the soil with one cell organisms, bacteria, worms, and all of them communicate with each other and with the plant, with the tree. And the plant is not just a simple plant growing somewhere, seeing the soil just as something to find some anchorage, but the plant is a separate living organism communicating with peers, with bacteria. The plant is chatting around a little bit, getting help. Acacia, for instance, that in the desert stand in a little wood that may be eaten by an antelope, for instance, will exude ethylene, a sweet gas going over many, many kilometers, telling the acacia that there are some antelopes eating them. And what the other acacia would do is immediately they will produce special substances the antelopes won't like, because that's very bitter, a substance. Or the maize or a corn, for instance, the plant stands there with the UV rays being too strong. It starts forming pigments in order not to get a sunburn. And when the little caterpillar comes around biting into the maize plant, the maize will know, because of the saliva, what enemy he's confronted with, will send out emergency messages, and then certain substances will be produced that somehow destroy the caterpillar. We don't know what is below the soil. The fact that the plant and the trees and with the microcosmos below our feet are communicating all the time. There are some roots that react to electrical impulses, and I think they can move about 1 centimeter an hour, like worms, until the electrical impulse reaches its aim. They can scan stones and rocks, understand what rocks they are confronted with, finding a new root, or like the acacia, for instance, or robinia as it is called, they get bacteria to join them, helping them opening up the nitrogen from the air. There's a special fungus, or a kind of a fungus, mycorrhiza, with up to 80–90% lives in a symbiosis with other plants. And without this fungus, no plants could have settled down on our earth. This fungus has very fine rhizomes, finer than any other mushroom. On 1 centimeter of its root, some 80,000 meters of fungal threads have been counted. Thus, the root size is being inaugurated. That's important for communication, for keeping water in the soil, and for transporting communication. So we can imagine it in the following way, with the roots where the various fungal fibers get into, and it's like an email communicating with another plant or another bacteria at some other site. Just digest that. There is some symbiotic fungus that helps the plant for the exchange of water, for sugar coming from the light going into the fungus, and the fungus in turn provides the nutrients helping to treat water and opening up phosphorus, for instance, something the plant couldn't even be able to do. So the plant permanently strives for communicating with its environment like in a little village, setting up alliances, detecting whether it's a friend or an enemy. That's something the plant is able to analyze. So we have only learned that now there are 23 factors the plant would scan, including light and the center of Earth, for instance, temperature, humidity, to, in a very careful and considerate way, to develop strategies as to what to do next and how to communicate. This mycorrhiza, for instance, may be too bold, let's say, settling in an successful way, then the plant will start digesting the fungus, and otherwise the plant would be killed. So they say, stop. We don't know anything about that. So what would we do in agriculture, for instance, with this system of the fine plants and our world of soils? When we put various nutrients onto the fields, and when we use artificial phosphorus, for instance, we will do exactly what plant in nature would do if it was in some balance. If we were to perceive that it was not necessary. The same is true for nitrogen with the leguminosis, for instance. But reality today in the fields is that we have high performance plants that we bred, and this is a surprise, that were bred only for high performance, with no one reflecting on whether these plants can still communicate with each other. And the blunt answer is no. They no longer know how to listen, how to talk. They are deaf and muted. So they have nutrients, the quality we expect a conventional field to deliver. What we use here in our fields in terms of pesticides and fertilizers make sure that this disastrous chain is triggered. We find that in all of the individual links of the chain, it starts with the wrong treatment of the soil. It has to do with the wrong species, with hybrid wheat or genetically modified microorganisms that was inoculated with a Roundup-ready pesticide, for instance, a glyphosate. Some produce to destroy plants, that is called plant protection liquid by industry, destroying everything with the exception of genetically resistant seeds that we produce in terms of genetically modified organisms. We use that in Germany to keep the soils clean, as if the soil were a cupboard we could just tidy up. Anywhere where life is, on every square millimeter, life wants to fight its ground, saying, where I place my foot I am. When you take an empty area, some brown soil somewhere in nature, this already is a sign of weakness, disease, illness, or some dead, eroded soil. Nature doesn't know any brown soils, and nature doesn't know any monoculture. This is why we have the problems with various insects, fungal organisms, fibers, and they just infest everything. The problem is that monocultures is what we need for our production of food, because there is one thing, trade and the food manufacturers put into the foreground, that's reproducibility, storageability, and safety of food supply. You may now argue, what is the safety of food supply? We have so many high standards today that destroy our SMEs. Many shops had to close their doors because they could no longer comply with these industrial standards. Little dairy shops, for instance, cheese and meat producing companies, propagating an industrial standard as if there were good and bad bacteria. All bacteria, they say, have to be killed. Our food has to be sterilized in order to provide some safety in the unsafety of our world, where we no longer know what we eat and how we are somehow linked with our soil, wherever it comes from. Not even the producers know where the food comes from. In case of the scandal of horse meat, for instance, food manufacturers process foods for us, and whenever there is a scandal, they say, how should I know what the ingredients are, what our food contains, what the foodstuffs are? So when you say we need transparency and we need chains we can trace back, that's not possible. If that's not feasible, obviously there is something wrong with the system, and we should, as quickly as possible, change it. Well, I thought someone wanted to say something here on stage now. Was a bit distracted, I'm sorry. So since we now have our destroyed soils and the plants have been bred with herbicides, fungicides, pesticides that could no longer live because all of our plants have been adapted to the regional soils, to their own language, to their neighbor's language. You can't just replant them, putting them somewhere else, relocate them. What we have in terms of hybrid wheat is as if you would send a naked woman who was done surgery to the North Pole, say, I'm going to give you some fur coat with you. Without the fur coat, she couldn't survive. What's so crazy about wheat is that with the mineral fertilizers and the pesticides, it's being attacked so much, making sure that wheat turns lazy. Not lazy, saying spoiled, but saying I no longer have to communicate because I will get enough foodstuffs from above in excess. Not the soil will be fed, but the plant only. And the result is that we observe the same phenomenon with plants as with our youngsters. Overnourished, fat-disposed youngsters, couch potatoes, isolating themselves. So that's exactly the same what wheat would do. And whenever there is some drought or too much rain, any storm, they just collapse because suddenly they recognize that they are alone. They don't know what to do because they didn't learn how to use bacteria, for instance, to transport the necessary acids, for instance, silic acid, making sure that they can better store the water. Well, that's the soil. But I'm also a cook, a chef, going from the soil into the cooking pan is a short way, and some are not aware of that. Maybe you are aware of that because you've been listening to the presentations all day long. So we have the soil, the species, but it's also the fodder, wheat, soybeans, fed in monocultures for our meat consumption. The animals eat the sick wheat. We eat the sick chickens, for instance, and the animals that are administered way too many antibiotics and that are bred in a very horrible way, very cruel. I'm sure that in 20, 30 years we will say, what cruel times have these been that we admitted to things like these being done to our animals without anesthesia. We castrate them. Cows that have horns to socialize themselves, to find the right order. They exchange gases, for instance. We etch their horns, for instance, and we cut the beads of our chickens, for instance, in order not to have them cannibalize themselves and tearing out their feathers. Why do they do that? Because they are under lots of stress in big flocks. They can't recognize their family members anymore, and they start turning the screws, getting more and more aggressive because of the stress they are under. It's as if I put all of you into a small room, for instance, and when you start bashing each other, I'm going to amputate your arms. So we try to remedy the symptoms, but never ever do we want to understand what the actual origin of the problems is. And now we are all suddenly deterred, surprised that we deviated from the right pathway. And now we have to tell each other we need another word we like, whether it's industry that want to embark on any change, if it's not politicians who succeed in doing that because there are too many other interests to cover. We have to start a grassroots movement. We have to find our ties like a soil that is healthy, not like the lazy wheat, but the wild wheat. We have to stand up, say it's enough. We have to start networking. What can we do together? And I'm very happy because today I learned that there are so many young people sitting in the audience here in the Imperial Palace being interested in these topics, saying this is my future and the future of my children and their children. We, the old ones, maybe will say, well, if we're lucky enough, I'm not going to experience that anymore. So I do have my stake and maybe buy a 20th T-shirt and maybe a second car. And when it comes to the future and future generations, the climate, the soil, the water, any other countries, and for honorable people, nothing, no future for them. Because there won't be any future. Our future has to be ecological or there won't be any future. Full stop. The fact that we eat the right foodstuffs, have the right food, parts of nature, because our metabolism for 50,000 years has been fed in a natural way, and only for 30, 40 years we have eaten foodstuffs my grandmother wouldn't even have recognized as such. This is a dangerous step in humanity we are taking here. It's not about the taste only, even though I believe that when you're not manipulated with many additives and aroma stuff and glutamate, for instance, we have our brain in our guts as well, having some common sense. And when you eat natural food, you will be interested in things you couldn't get when you, for instance, have 4 grams of dried chicken in some soup package. I don't know that. 1 liter of water and 4 grams of dried chicken. Just imagine that. Why? Who will benefit from such a development? Definitely not you. When I talk to an industrialist from the food industry, when I was getting outraged saying it's only about maximizing your financial benefit, he told me, well, Miss Wiener, you can't really blame the wolf for catching sheep. Well, nice words, but then we shouldn't be sheep anymore. Well, what are my hopes? I sincerely hope that you will start networking, that you show your commitment in every way, that you maybe go home and say, I also want to be some grass and cooperate here in the grass movement. I'm going to see some herbs now on my balcony, or maybe I'll join an urban movement, and I'm not only going to eat my filet steak, I will eat the whole animal from the snout to the tail. And when I do eat meat, I want to make sure to eat meat that was produced in the right way, because you don't want to swallow sorrow. Maybe you focus on vegetarian food rather. Maybe you eat what other people throw away. Or maybe you say cooking and doing my shopping is a political statement. Responsibility rests on your shoulders. We can't any longer say, well, that's my private benefit, and whatever I don't eat, I'll just throw away because I did pay for it. Unfortunately, everything is more complicated. Things turned more complex. But the good news is that cooking yourselves is such a joyful experience, a very central experience at that. Enhancing communication. Fine motorics can thus be trained. Your bodily strength and your self-awareness can be raised, because with the right dish you can say, I love you. You can support the right things with small regional farmers, for instance, and Austria is such a great example for that. This is a real gift. Austria is small, but Austria could be a pioneer in organic farming. Austria is a pioneer, but it could be much more. You could keep up the flag and say, well, we have to do more. And certainly we are all against TTIP. And yes, we want to make sure to support our regional economy. And certainly we want to make sure that our children can enjoy the earth later on. You already keep saving money for your children and you pick expensive schools. Why do you do that? Because children won't survive anywhere if we just continue doing the same all over again. Well, I didn't want to end my presentation on this negative note, I have to admit, but I wanted to be the revolutionary here. Just go home, cook a nice meal using regional and seasonal, organically grown foodstuffs. Thank you very much for listening.